Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. So when is a diplomatic pouch not a diplomatic pouch? Well, as far as Spain is concerned, it's when it goes from an embassy to the capital city or vice versa. However, British Foreign Office officials said there was no doubt that the bags checked by Spanish officials as they left Gibraltar were the property of Her Majesty's government. The incident marked the first time any British diplomatic bag has been searched by any EU or NATO member. The Vienna Convention guarantees the immunity of these communications. But a Spanish source close to the Prime Minister of Spain, Mariano Rajoy, has said adamantly that they did not contravene the convention as Gibraltar is merely a British territory. London and Gibraltarians may beg to differ as the ante appears to have been upped over this rocky promontory on the southern tip of Europe. Last week, Spanish activists and fishermen hurled insults at the political chief of Gibraltar, Fabian Picado, preventing him from speaking to law students in Spain. Earlier in the year, Gibraltar dropped 70 concrete blocks into the sea, saying it aimed to create an artificial reef. But Spain complained that the barrier prevented Spanish fishing boats that trawl for shellfish from operating in the area. Spain then introduced stringent border checks in August, leading to lengthy delays for motorists. This latest spat may be over a bag, but there's certainly plenty of baggage that goes way back to when Spain ceded Gibraltar to Britain in perpetuity in 1713. Madrid has long argued that it should be returned to Spanish sovereignty, and the territory remains a source of diplomatic tension. But how British is Gibraltar? What is the future for the rock, and what are the issues surrounding it? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Inigo Gurruchaga, who's the London correspondent for the newspaper El Correo, Richard Norton-Taylor, who's defence and security editor at the Guardian newspaper. On the line, we have Dr. Gareth Stockey, who's a lecturer in Spanish studies at the University of Nottingham, and he's also a historian of Gibraltar and contemporary Spain. And Dominic Searle, the editor of the Gibraltar daily newspaper, the Gibraltar Chronicle. Warm welcome to you all. First of all, Dominic, the Times has claimed that Spain's ambassador to London was summoned by the Foreign Office over this bag incident, and he was apparently summoned also over the 22-hour incursion into British waters by the Spanish research ship. Is there a feeling where you are that there is a ramping up of tension?
Well, I think there is, and I think it's sort of shifting slightly away from the border directly to, if you like, poking directly at Britain itself. Because, I mean, one of the things that this whole episode shows that, rather sadly, the only thing that Spain seems to have in terms of an approach to Gibraltar is the extent to which it puts controls on at that border. It's a tap that it turns on and off. It's always been like that. They don't seem to have much else to offer the people of Gibraltar, which is a bit of a sad thing, but they are definitely upping the ante at the moment.
Inigo, Gibraltarians voted to remain under British sovereignty in 1967, more recently in 2002. That should be the end of it, shouldn't it?
Well, I think that it's impossible to understand what is happening now in Gibraltar or the attitude of the Spanish government without understanding or knowing that Gibraltarians and Britons, the British government and the Gibraltarian government, change unilaterally the international law about Gibraltar, the Treaty of Utrecht, the resolutions of the United Nations after Gibraltarians say yes to the Constitution in 2006, and that is the reality behind this. Yes, they are putting pressure on Britain, they are putting pressure on Gibraltar, but the reason is that the Jeeps and the Brits changed the law. Richard,
what's your reaction to that?
Well, my response is really, I have a test of this, and it goes for other parts of the world too. Dare I say it, the Falklands or the Malvinas Islands. But anyway, if you're a Martian coming to Britain for the first time from outer space, and you see what on earth is the Union Jacks doing at the end of the promontory of Gibraltar. Now, I know the Treaty of Utrecht 300 years ago exactly said what it said in perpetuity, but surely in 2013 you can get a deal whereby you have joint sovereignty. You can have self-determination by the Gibraltarians, but not what the British says, territorial integrity. Now, it just seems to me if you can't do a deal on this, a joint sovereignty, you preserve the rights of the Gibraltarians. If they want to eat bacon and have policemen with English hats on and stuff, that's fine. But you can minorities are protected in other countries too. Why can't they be protected? And also if there are military, maybe the listening posts, the British spy masts on the top of the rock may not matter so much as they used to, but surely a deal can be done between two mature countries.
Dominic, I'll get your reaction to that. Surely a deal can be done by two mature countries, Spain and the UK.
Well, I mean, there's two things I would say there. I mean, the way in which Richard is presenting it is actually out of date itself. You might have done that 100 years ago and got away with it, but the reality now is whether you go on about Utrecht or any other treaties, the people have rights. And frankly, the Bobbies thing and the whole thing, that cliche is so gone from the 60s. It's really out of touch. I mean, the reality with Gibraltarians is we keep some of those things for the tourists because they like it. It's the Spaniards who come over to have their pictures with telephone boxes and bobbies. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we're quite a modern society, and when on our telephones are much like everybody else is everywhere else in the world. They're mobiles and people, dealing with situations. So I think we've got to move away from that tired idea that UK and Spain can just do a deal over the heads of the people. I accept that there's an international complexity here, and there are issues to be addressed. But certainly, that isn't the way to go about it. I think ultimately self-determination either has a meaning or it doesn't. And the Spanish contention that we're tourists in our own land is not acceptable to people who live here.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the future of Gibraltar. With me in the studio is Richard Norton-Taylor, the Defence and Security Editor at The Guardian newspaper, Inigo Gurruchaga, who's the London correspondent for the newspaper El Correo. On the line, Dr. Gareth Stockey, a lecturer in Spanish Studies at the University of Nottingham, and Dominic Searle, editor of the Gibraltar daily newspaper, The Gibraltar Chronicle. Gareth Stockey, you're a historian of Gibraltar. I'm just wondering how much of a factor are the current tensions are a reminder that EU members have conflicting strategic imperatives. I mean, clearly it's a strategic point, but Britain's navy doesn't have overwhelming superiority in the strait. It can still block access in the strait if need be. But I mean, how much of a factor is that kind of strategic point of Gibraltar in terms of how the current tensions are being played out?
I think it's fair to say that Britain no longer sees Gibraltar as a key defensive post as it was for much of the 300 years of British rule, as literally as a fortress of Britain and British power on the European mainland, and that's long since been the case. As a naval base, possibly still very important, though of course the Spanish would argue that as a member of NATO, Britain would still retain the use of Gibraltar as a NATO ally, should Gibraltar be handed over to Spain. I think Dominic's point is actually the crucial one here, that things have moved on even since the 1960s when that first referendum was held. And Britain has committed itself in two constitutional documents now for the Gibraltarians, rightly or wrongly, to respect the wishes of the Gibraltarians in regard to self-determination. So British governments of whatever stripe have committed themselves to protect Gibraltarian interests. And as long as that is the case, one can't see British official government policy changing.
Richard, you want to weigh in?
Well, self-determination is one thing, sovereignty is another. Sovereignty is actually getting increasingly less important because you're a member of NATO, you give sovereignty away when you're a member of the EU and so on and so forth. So I just think that you can respect in real, practical and pragmatic and principled ways the question of self-determination of the Gibraltarian people, at the same time as having the Rock Gibraltar as what I would say territorial integrity, as which the UN also talks about. At the same time, can't you have a deal? You have minorities in all sorts of countries.
Well, indeed, and the Spanish government and certainly the current Spanish government would probably point to the 1978 Spanish Constitution and the provision within the Spanish Constitution to have historical communities recognised with a degree of internal self-government and so forth. Though, of course, in those areas of Spain which are most adamant that they wish to see a change of that structure and wish to see increased power for their regions, possibly even independence, like the Basque Country and Catalonia, you actually find that the so-called Spanish view of Gibraltar is often very different. Over the summer we saw Barcelona football fans holding up banners supporting the Gibraltarians' case against this recent Spanish action against the border. So it's not as simple as to say there is a Spanish view. And indeed, many parts of Spain, many minorities within the Spanish state, would regard the Gibraltarians' claim as very strong.
And I'll bring in Inigo Gurruchaga. You write for the Basque newspaper El Correo, and I'm just wondering, first of all, I mean, the Catalans are talking about breaking away again from Spain. I mean, is this a classic diversion from Rajoy, perhaps?
I don't think so. I believe that they are quite capable of conspiring to build up tension in Gibraltar to hide some domestic matter of more entity, but I don't believe that this is a crisis due to that. I think this crisis is due to the fact that Mr. Margallo, the Spanish foreign minister, took office and he discovered that he London had sent him a letter saying that they were never going to initiate a negotiation, a dialogue with Spain without the previous agreement of the Gibraltarians. That was a unilateral change of the law, and Spain had engaged for the previous 4 or 5 years in a multilateral dialogue with Gibraltarians and others to find accommodation about local issues. That is the reason for this dispute, and all of that, and the idea that is due to the economic crisis and a way of covering it. They are quite capable of doing that, but it is not.
But how do Spanish people feel, Inigo? I mean, it has its own issues of breakaway regions in the Basque Country, of course, and Catalonia. I mean, do Spanish people get exercised by this particular issue about Gibraltar and that this must be Spanish?
Most people, I would think, are deeply indifferent. They have enough problems of their own. Obviously, when there are issues in the Basque Country or Catalonia, the question of self-determination and sovereignty, concepts like that are discussed, and then the question of Gibraltar come around. The saddest thing of this crisis, and I think the Spanish government and others have a big responsibility on this, is that we are seeing tensions, hooliganism, abuse, and intolerable abuse, the intimidation of the chief minister the other day in Algeciras, and that requires leaders, political leaders, having a voice and stopping that immediately.
Dominic Searle, I'll turn back to you. Gibraltar does border a region which has high unemployment, and Gibraltar seems to be a good place to work for many Spaniards. For instance, it's had good economic growth over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, do the people that border Gibraltar, the Andalusians and so on, do they kind of eye the rock quite jealously and have a vested interest in its economic well-being?
I mean, I think, well, obviously, the people of La Línea, essentially, because, I mean, the Campo and Andalusia is a very large region, but essentially the people of La Línea is the town that has always, in a sense, many ways, suffered. I mean, when the border was closed between 1969 and 1985, it was La Línea that most of the people left. I mean, Gibraltar, wasn't having a happy time, but it was supported by the UK, but those people had to leave Spain. And, whenever things get tough, they get very tough in La Línea. I mean, I think where you have to look at it is picking up a couple of the points that have been mentioned. And for a start, the change of the Constitution in 2006, that happened whilst we were in a process of dialogue, and Spain accepted that as an internal change within the Gibraltar regime, and that was the Moratinos government. And I think, what we're seeing all the time here, and one shouldn't forget, is that Margallo, the Spanish foreign minister, keeps saying that he wants to take the issue back to 2004, that is prior to the socialist government under Moratinos entering into tripartite talks. I think what people forget is that for about 8 years before that, the so-called Brussels process was a complete failure. It never met. Nobody ever engaged in anything. It didn't succeed in achieving anything. And I think, when you look at the broader issues of Spain and the Spanish Constitution, for instance, there are a lot of complaints about the fact that it looks specifically at the rights of Spanish citizens rather than all citizens. You've got to, and I don't totally disagree with Richard in one respect. There are things to talk about here, but Spain has accommodated other variations of agreements. It has Andorra. It needs to be much more forward-looking and take us from where we already are. I mean, the reality is that Gibraltar has got used to a level of democracy, and if what Spain offers us is poverty right at our front door and aggressive government, why on earth would we want to be Spanish or move in that direction? And I think if you look at the projects that the socialists were following, it was a long-term project that could end up, we don't know where, but I mean, I doubt if we'd end up becoming part of Spain, but we might end up resolving the sovereignty issue, and that would be great for everyone. And there's lots of ways to skin the cat, and I think by just simply closing the border and saying I'm going to do a deal with UK, which is not going to happen for UK reasons. I mean, David Cameron has his own reasons for supporting Gibraltar. I think we're wasting time.
And I think just to follow up on Dominic's point there, the PP bitterly opposed the tripartite process and opposed the PSOE's direction of travel over dialogue, not just with Britain, but for the first time with Gibraltarians represented at the talks as equal members, and more broadly the PSOE's policy of trying to relax border controls and adopt a very long view on what they would see as the Gibraltar problem. The paper oppose all of that. It's perfectly in keeping with their stated policy over several years to reverse that process and to try to go back to a process of bilateral rather than trilateral discussion.
I agree with Dominic in many, insofar as it is absurd and rather, I mean, I would say childish, although it's got more nasty effects than that, having stopping the border traffic, have the controls on the borders and things like that seem to be actually quite pathetic. And certainly it doesn't encourage anyone in Gibraltar to be more sympathetic to Spain. But you can bang your heads together another way, calm down on both sides. I mean, maybe I'm asking too much at the moment. I go back to the whole question, it can't go on like this. And there is a difference, but sovereignty matters much less than people think, and the politicians, including British politicians, say. And there is a difference, but you can accommodate the question of sovereignty with self-determination, with territorial integrity. I think so. Most of the people in the United Nations also think so.
Do you think so, Inigo? That accommodation can happen?
A change in attitude, I think, would be required in Spain, certainly. Probably the sorting out of military problems, of how... I have asked different British foreign ministers whether they would repeat the words that they said about Northern Ireland, that Britain has not self-interest in the area. And none of them has been able to say that.
Good point.
So Britain has an interest in staying there. And that should be as well part of the agreement. And as well the question of, self-determination and poverty on the other side, the self-determination to build an offshore center that complies with all the rules that make possible for Margaret Thatcher to have her house in the Virgin Islands, register that. That is something that as well is part of the problem. And it should be part of a solution or a focus on the colonies, real colonies, even they don't name them like that, but of Spain in Northern Africa, in Morocco, etc. I think there should be a whole package to change the attitude to sort out the problems of the Strait, a wonderful place in the world and of great strategic importance.
Richard, I noted with interest there was a question put in the House of Commons about the Spanish vessel issue, and it was a Ledbury MP, Bill Wiggin. He asked whether Argentina is in fact encouraging Spain to provoke the UK over Gibraltar, invoking the idea of the Falklands. And I'm just wondering, I mean, is this a bit fanciful or is this a possibility? Is Argentina in cahoots with Spain?
Well, I don't know whether they're in cahoots privately or not, but I mean, they don't need to be really, do they? I mean, it's quite clear. The Argentinians certainly are piling on the pressure too. The other day they said that anyone exploring oil, rather Falklands, Malvinas, will be subject to Argentinian law as a criminal offence and so on and so forth. So they're upping the rhetoric and stuff too, but there must be a deal too. By the way, on the Falklands, since you mentioned it, even after the invasion of the Falklands by the Argentinian forces in 1982, Margaret Thatcher said, even after the physical invasion, and the task force is on its way, Margaret Thatcher said, OK, let's do a deal, shared sovereignty and so on and so forth, which the British, of course, have always proposed before 1982.
Dominic, is there any kind of affinity between Gibraltarians and the plight of those in the Falkland Islands? I know they're two very different situations, but I mean, is there some kind of feeling of fraternity there?
Well, I suppose, at times there's a sense of common destiny and common problems. I think it's always dangerous not just to sort of bag everything together, but I think dangerous for Spain itself to identify itself with Argentina. I mean, when it used to come up with the argument of Hong Kong, China, it had the same problem. At the end of the day, Spain is a democracy. I'd be much more worried if I was someone living in Soto, Malaysia, which frontiers with Morocco, which has continuous real human problems at every level. That you're beside a much more difficult, complex government. And I think what we have to understand here is that we all have to work to certain rules. Certainly, what seems to be the result of the visit by the European Commission to that border. I mean, on the one side, it's telling Gibraltar, look, you can't, you've got to do something about having these tobacco issues, which are smuggling issues for Spain. And it's telling Spain, you can carry out checks, but you've got to carry them out properly. I mean, this weekend, in the first time in 6 months that I crossed for a private reason into Spain, there were only 2 cars down in front because I rushed down when I looked at the camera and saw that there were very few cars there. The car in front of me was stopped for 20 minutes. I mean, what's the purpose of that when there was a second lane they could have got other traffic to go on? And that sort of hatred is going to take ages to get rid of compared to the speed at which they put in these controls.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the future of Gibraltar with Richard Norton-Taylor, Inigo Gurruchaga, Dr. Gareth Stockey and Dominic Searle. Gareth Stockey, maybe Gibraltar would welcome the chance to argue, say, in the European Court of Justice, this particular spat, and taking it to that European level would be exactly something that could perhaps or put it to rest for some time.
I think that's true, and Gibraltar and the UK government acting on Gibraltar's behalf has long argued for to place these matters before international law. They haven't necessarily had the success that they wanted at the United Nations, of course. You also have, and I've spoken to many people over the summer about this when the border queues began in earnest. You have the bizarre site, and European media operations that have asked me about this have all commented of the most Eurosceptic British governments in the last 25 years, nonetheless appealing to Europe for help over the Gibraltar border delays. So from the European perspective, it's quite different. I think that the issue that we're looking at now with the border is obviously counterproductive. If the Spanish government's real aim is to win hearts and minds in Gibraltar, everyone on the ground can see that it's counterproductive. Spaniards in La Linea can see that it's counterproductive. And again, I spent most of my career so far writing about Gibraltar in the early 20th century when the border was practically non-existent between Spain and Gibraltar, and whereby, for all intents and purposes, Gibraltarians were moving steadily closer to, should we say, a more Spanish cultural outlook than a British cultural outlook. And that stopped in the mid-1950s with General Franco, and these kind of policies of obstruction on the border have simply worked against that process. I think the PSOE was serious about a long-term hearts and minds campaign, beginning with loosening restrictions on the border, and the current government has reversed it. They will rue it.
And you're basically saying that the hearts and minds of Spaniards themselves are very indifferent about this particular thing, and maybe the issue of something like Ceuta, an area like Ceuta, is an example of hypocrisy in terms of the Spanish position.
Well, hypocrisy. If you believe actually that the government of Spain wants the sovereignty of Gibraltar now, I don't think they do. I think that what they are looking is to, as Dominic has said as well, to go back to 2004 and to try to set out the resolution of the Gibraltar issue on the basis of bilateral negotiations with London and with no presence of Gibraltar. Probably they will not succeed, but certainly is the tradition of the policy of the Partido Popular, who is now in government, yeah.
Dominic Searle, what about the identity of Gibraltarians? Does the identity of their plight solidify when there are issues of what they consider bullying, border closures and all that kind of stuff? Is there kind of do they feel a bit of a siege mentality as well?
The sieges, I think, I always say we're genetically programmed for, and we sort of cope with. I'm a fairly moderate guy. I'm a great believer in dialogue. My papers always advocated dialogue. And I have to say that I get, very angry about this, and all the people I know who would be, if you like, the most reasonable camp, serious camp that you're going to get in Gibraltar in terms of discussions and dialogue with Spain. All of us just feel that we've just been kicked back to 20 years ago, and it really is not going to get anywhere. And Inigo's right. There's no way that the Spanish government thinks it's going to get Gibraltar back this way. This is really all about freezing our status. And I think largely about the fact that they're much more worried about what's going to happen up north in Spain. They're much more worried about what could be the snowball effect if Scotland went into independent. And basically, they just want to cut us short. They weren't worried. The tobacco issue has been there all along. There's been lots of other issues all along. There've been Gibraltarians living in Spain. All these things that they seem to be suddenly getting very excited about were there all along, and they weren't bothered with them. What I think really scored the goal this year was our entry into UEFA, because I think that suddenly signaled to them, hang on a second, these people could eventually become independent just by sort of dissolving into a recognition globally. And that, I think, is what worries the Spanish government most.
And Gibraltar had a very good result in their first game against Slovakia. I think they drew. Is that correct?
Yes, 0-0 was a great victory for
Not bad going for such a small place.
I think it's fair also to say that from the Gibraltarian side of the frontier, it's very important to realise that when Spain and the UK talk about Gibraltar and issues such as the football, that there are much bigger issues at play for those two countries. So it's very easy to see Spain's campaign against Gibraltar membership of UEFA as simply another piece of Spanish intransigence. But in fact, the Spanish states and Spanish sporting authorities are worried that this might set a precedent whereby Catalonia would have its own national football team, where the Basque Country would have its own national football team. And in those areas there have been calls in some quarters for sporting recognition. And so you always have to view it through that lens. As Dominic has just said, as well, the British government now has to worry about these issues in relation to Scottish independence and so forth. So occasionally there's a tendency in Gibraltar to forget that actually for London and Madrid, these are part of much bigger problems and that they need to view them in a much sort of wider context.
Except Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland have had independent, separate soccer teams, national soccer teams, but it doesn't make any difference to their political status so far.
From really what Dominic is saying, Richard, it seems unlikely that any line is going to be drawn under this anytime soon.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just would hope, and this is maybe cloud cuckoo land for the moment, that wiser people should calm everyone down, whether it's the British in Westminster or some Gibraltarians, which are being provoked, I understand that completely, and members of the Spanish government, of course, because the Spanish government must know this is not going to get anywhere. It's been said on this programme. They're on hiding ground if they bang away in the way they've been doing. It's just counterproductive. So I just hope that wiser, sooner rather than later, wiser heads will prevail, and you can get over very easily, in my view, and I think the younger generation of my children say this too, flying the flag, sovereignty is getting less and less important. But human rights and self-determination increasingly important, sovereignty not.
Dominic, just finally, we're wrapping up, but the UK Independence Party did suggest that Gibraltar integrate more deeply into the UK and suggested that Gibraltar even have an MP. Far-fetched, but what do you think of that proposal?
Well, I mean, I think actually that Gibraltar's got to sort out its own problems. I'm not sure that getting onto the UKIP agenda is the best thing for us. It's nice for people to say supportive things, but at the end of the day, we are where we are. We've got to have a long-term relationship with Spain. That entitles, that needs them to recognise certain rights on our side and us to recognise some of the problems they might have. I think we shouldn't sort of build up false, ideas and sort of be living here in a bubble. And I think that, what I'd really love to see actually is the Spanish government finally spend real money on the Spanish side of the border, make La Línea into a really decent place, and create a sort of more level, playing field for everyone in the region, so that we can actually get on with each other and not have these sort of problems. And I think that the big difference now compared to the last time is that on this occasion, this Spanish government has come in when the economy is weak, when people in the campo are really in a bad... I mean, it's 50% unemployment in La Línea, right across the board, not just the young people. And that's a disaster.
And just finally, Inigo, do you anticipate the flags of all three, both Gibraltar, Britain, Spain, flying on the rock in generations to come? What do you think?
The great weakness of Spain in the diplomacy around Gibraltar is that the two main parties have different opinions. So it's a question of balancing. This party will have a strong line, the Socialist Party will have a softer line. So it's very difficult to see any long-term agreement with everyone celebrating flags or no flags. Basically, I agree with Richard, it's about mixing people. Flags, I don't care if there are no flags there.
That's Inigo Gurruchaga, who's a London correspondent for the newspaper El Correo, Richard Norton-Taylor, Defence and Security Editor of the Guardian newspaper, and on the line, Dominic Searle, Editor of the Gibraltar daily newspaper, the Gibraltar Chronicle, and Dr. Gareth Stocky, a lecturer in Spanish Studies at the University of Nottingham. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.